Good evening, and welcome to the New York Society for Ethical Culture. My name is Ann Klaeysen. I'm a leader here at the Society, and it's a great joy for me to welcome you to our home. This is the meeting house of the New York Society for Ethical Culture. We were founded in 1876 by Felix Adler, and this meeting house was completed in 1910, so we recently had our centennial. And it's just a delight to have all of you here, and I know you're going to have a very interesting evening. We come from different traditions with different perspectives, and we find a great deal of common ground. And to speak about common ground and common cause, I'd like to introduce Susan Lerner, who's the Executive Director of Common Cause. Susan?
Thank you so much. As you have just heard, I'm Susan Lerner. I'm the Executive Director of Common Cause New York, and I want to thank our co-sponsors, the Society for Ethical Culture, for their support and the use of this wonderful space. Campaign finance reform is often dry and a nebulous topic. It's rarely understood within the full scope of our democracy. That's why we wanted to put together this conversation, to provide another point of entry for a complex issue which so deeply affects us all. Our goal is really, for those of you who are supporters of campaign finance reform, to give you a different way to think and talk about this issue. And for those who aren't quite sure what they think about it, also a way to think about the topic from a different point of view than you may have heard it discussed previously. Those of us who are good government advocates talk about campaign finance reform and the challenge to our democracy. We talk about official corruption. We talk about it in terms of public policy and constitutional law and statutory law. But there's a whole other dimension that we as good government people really aren't the ones to raise, and that really is the questions that the faith traditions grapple with, the morality of corruption, and how we as a society band together and how we take care of the least among us. And so we thought that it would be a different approach to this issue, to invite leaders from the different faith traditions to tell us about how inequality and corruption are approached within their teachings and their scripture. You may have noticed we've got a video camera set up in the back. We are capturing the discussion. Hopefully we'll be able to turn it into a short piece that will be helpful in helping congregations and others across the state engage in this discussion in a different way, because we think that this issue has dimensions that are way beyond simply the political. And so we are so pleased to have with us this distinguished panel of religious and humanist thinkers, representing a broad array of perspectives from Judaism, Islam, Christianity, and humanism. We have Reverend Dr. Alison Boden, who is the Dean of Religious Life at Princeton University, who's talking to us about the Christian and the Protestant tradition. Leader Ann Klaeysen is a humanist chaplain at the Society of Ethical Culture. We're very happy that we're joined by Imam Feisal Abdul Rauf, who is the founder of the Cordoba Institute and an internationally recognized Islamic theologian, and also very pleased that Rabbi David Saperstein was willing to travel from Washington to join us. He's the director of the Religious Action Center and is a well-recognized activist in the Reform Jewish tradition. And we are also very honored to have as our moderator Donald Shriver, who is the President Emeritus of the Union Theological Seminary and the author of several books on politics and religion. You should have received an index card when you came in, and we're going to ask you to write the questions that you have on the cards. But I'd also like to suggest to you that the first question we'd like you to share with us is, what did you hope to learn in coming today? Something about the topic obviously sparked an interest, and that way at the end of the presentation, while we're gathering cards that relate to what you've heard, we can be sure that we've answered your particular interests in the presentation. And we ask that if there are press members today, that they reserve their questions until after the panel concludes and audience members have had a chance to be heard. And panelists will be around afterwards for the media. So I'm very honored to present our panel discussion on the moral imperatives of campaign finance reform and turn this over to our moderator, Don Shriver. Don.
We have asked each member of this panel to portray something of the religious background of their thinking regarding the moral imperatives in campaign finance reform.
What's going on?
Do I turn this on?
We're not sure. Let's see, this one works. Is yours working? If it is, why don't you give Don yours? Oh, it's working now, Don. Just talk right into it.
You need to speak right into it.
Yeah, speak right into it.
We say kiss the mic.
You can hear me now? No.
Try this one. Then try one of the other ones.
We've asked each member of this panel to portray something of the religious background of their thinking about campaign finance reform, and I'm sure something about the religious ethic that informs their political ethics. Each has a distinctive background, and we're going to begin by having several minutes from each of us in which we discuss something of that background. We'll start with Dr. Boden.
Thank you. This doesn't sound like it's on.
No. Let's continue to pass that around then.
This.
Thank you. Okay. As I think from a Protestant Christian tradition about campaign finance reform, there's so many different directions that I can go in. I chose one in particular, and I did it because it gets down to something that for me is absolutely fundamental about Christian ethics. And it is what I call, just my own words for it, the radical equality of human value. The radical equality of human value. And I imagine that thinkers in other religious traditions have bases for these in their own traditions too, and that's wonderful. In terms of Christianity, some of the texts that inform this for me would be from the letter to the Galatians, chapter 3, verse 28. In Christ there is no Jew or Gentile, slave or free, male or female, but all are one in Jesus Christ. And some people say, well, okay, that's talking about human equality within the Christian community. Many of us who are Christian think, no, that's only one beginning way to think about it. This is a statement about race and religion, Jew, Gentile. It is about slave and free, that's economic and legal status, male and female, about how gender is understood in many different ways by any person. Another text, several coming from the book of Genesis in 3 different chapters, relate to what is known in Latin among the churches as Imago Dei. Humanity is made in the image of God. Every single human being in the image of God. Does that mean we all somehow got God's nose? No, it's about something certainly much deeper, something much more elemental. These are just 2 particular texts that inform my understanding of the radical equality of human value. And in this is implicit the idea that human worth never equals net worth. Human value has nothing to do with the material value that accrues to a person in his or her life in absolutely any way. People may have different levels of wealth. People may come from many different backgrounds, any kind of constructed idea of difference that we have, but we always retain this radical equality of human value. In practical terms, the most obvious way that I see that being breached in terms of policy in the United States today has to do with health care. If we all are of the same value as human beings, that some people absolutely live longer because they have more resources, they have access to more health care, their illnesses are diagnosed at all or diagnosed sooner when there is more of an opportunity for it to be treated. They have the means to seek out treatment, whatever it is that might help in their cure. And other people do not. What kind of statement is this about the value of one human being versus another? That, I guess I said, is the most obvious one to me, but there is education also. Every different category, every means to human well-being, I think, is a very obvious testimony to how we value human beings. The level of well-being that we permit for human beings, I think, has to do with how we literally value them as individuals or members of particular groups. When it comes to current campaign finance funding structure, I see it as a real compromise to political equality. Jesus never directly addresses political equality in the Gospels. He didn't live in a democracy. He lived under a pretty brutal Roman occupation. But the political equality that we're to enjoy today as citizens of a democracy and part of a democratic capitalistic order has to be elemental to our total social and political order. And I see the way that campaign financing happens as a real challenge to political equality, because greater wealth equals greater power in this. If you have money, you can buy the favor of legislators and try to influence how laws are made and to have them made in your favor, which I do think of as a breach of political equality. I think the Citizens United case points to an understanding that money, in terms of financing elections, is equated with speech. And we can get into that if you want. I am in no way a constitutional scholar. But I think that this understanding creates unequal speech, unequal levels and access to speech. And as I'm saying, a fundamental idea of the Christian tradition is human equality. And I think that political equality in the 21st century needs to be understood, at least in a democratic context, as an important category. If money is speech, then this is unequal speech, and I think that it has real ramifications for human value, which is to say for human well-being. Not just the niceties we may want for ourselves and want to influence legislators in one way or another so that we can have more of whatever it is we want for ourselves. It comes down to some basic things like funding or not funding Head Start, which I think has a lot to do with human well-being for the more vulnerable children in the United States. I think that has to do with the fundamental equality of human value. It has to do with nutrition, food assistance, assistance to families with children, federal funding for health care, support for that for different projects, for public education, for public hospitals. So what I'm trying to do is take the idea of political equality as compromised by the current way we finance our elections and bring that around full circle to human value, to real human well-being, and to say that I just find that to be a breach of what for me is central to Christian ethical thinking. I'm really grateful that we're having this conversation. And maybe it's just because I'm a Protestant Christian, but I feel so often that when people of faith are asked to opine on current issues, we segregate ourselves, at least my community does, into what Nicholas Kristof calls pelvic politics. And we get to talk about contraception, abortion, and homosexuality. I can't believe the 2012 election might have contraception as an issue. But there it is. I think another issue for another day that we might talk about the moral and religious ethical implications of is tax reform. I think it's very similar in a lot of ways to campaign finance reform. I've had fun in this last few days thinking about this issue, and it has reminded me of my old minister, William Sloane Coffin. I can still hear his gravelly voice saying, and this would be 20 or 30 years ago, "In the not-too-distant future, we're not going to have the representative from West Virginia. We're going to have the coal representative. And we're going to have the oil representative. And we're going to have the airlines representative. And we're going to have the big pharma representative," on and on. We aren't there yet. But he had a point then and now, and the way we are currently letting big money really influence our elections is going a long way towards the really bad scene that he was forecasting 20 and 30 years ago. Thanks.
Thank you. Dr. Klaeysen.
Thank you. Let's see if this works. Oh, yes, it does. Okay. Well, I'm speaking out of the humanist tradition, and specifically because humanism is a big tent, speaking specifically about ethical culture, which is my faith tradition. And this is religious humanism, and by that I mean that we respond to life, our sort of our response to life and the reverence for life has a religious feel for us. And there are, under that humanist tent, we also have those who are considered secular, and you've probably heard from some of them. We have the four horsemen, which include, Christopher Hitchens, sadly departed, Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett, and who am I missing? Richard Dawkins. So I would put those sort of under the more militant, atheist end of the spectrum. And at our end, in religious humanism, it's really putting ethics at the center of all of our experiences and looking for that common ground. And that's why I always feel so comfortable in interfaith settings, because the way that we first started ethical culture with Felix Adler, who was only 25 years old at the time, and so many of the portraits we see of him, he looks like this very old, austere gentleman, but he really was a young radical. And what he was proposing is that we move away from the history of mankind that puts people to death for their beliefs and looks to see where we can find common ground. And what all religions have in common is the desire to be good people, and the training and the teachings to help us to be better people in community. And so that's what we hope to do. That's our aspiration here at the Ethical Society, is to have a community with ethics at the center. What's also true for us is that we experience our religion of ethics in community as a democratic one. And we play that out in terms of our polity here, the way that we're organized. That's certainly all very democratic. But also in that first generation of leaders with Felix Adler, going back to the 19th century, there was almost a romanticism of democracy and how wonderful this can be. And we were responsible here at the New York Society for many institutions that really promoted democracy, whether it was our leaders signing the first proposal for the NAACP or for the ACLU, starting the visiting nurse service. It was always about how can we serve our communities and bring together people of different faiths to, again, do the right thing in terms of our treatment of each other. So democracy is a very important part of it. I'd like to follow up on what you said, Alison, because human dignity is at the center of our belief. And the belief is that we can't prove scientifically that we have worth and dignity, but it's an ethical choice to attribute that worth and dignity to every human being. And that's really the first ethical decision we make, is to say, I choose to attribute that worth and dignity to every human being. And so you can understand why that was so consistent with democracy, and why there was such a love of democracy in this country and within the founding of the society, because we felt that democracy was an expression of the belief in human worth and dignity. I want to make a distinction, because our founder did, between human worth and human value. And he felt that so often we are valued by what we own, what we do, what we can contribute, and that has its place. But if we only measure people in terms of their value and not in terms of intrinsic worth and dignity, then we're missing something. Because there are those that may seem to have no value to a community or to a society, and yet they have great worth and dignity. One of the challenges for me in Adler's teaching was something that he talked about in terms of that attribution of worth and dignity, because he speaks about our intellectual enemies. And on a chapter on forgiveness in his book called An Ethical Philosophy of Life, he has a very long footnote about these intellectual enemies. And he says, these are the people who, if their beliefs and if their outlook towards life were to be somehow the overriding organization of our society or the laws by which we live, we would find it difficult to breathe because they would be so antithetical to what we believe. And yet, he says, even they have a piece of the truth and must be honored and respected for what we can learn from them. And I think that's a challenge that we have, because as I think about Citizens United and campaign reform, I feel myself emotionally getting very angry about this and almost sort of having a knee-jerk liberal reaction to it. And that's when my ethical culture faith brings me back and forces me to really look at the different perspectives and not demonize those who have different opinions and different values, but look for the value in that argument. And I think the challenge with Citizens United, for example, has been taking a look at the perspective of it from the First Amendment in terms of free speech, but also, what's not often mentioned by some of the pundits, but certainly is very much there, is the 14th Amendment, and saying that corporations are people. Well, a created entity with unlimited life. Well, we have limited lives. And I think that the fact that we are mortal somehow adds, for me, more impetus to my ethical outlook on life. I want to make sure that my life counts for something, and that I make it a better place when I leave than when I came into it. And a corporation doesn't have that impulse. The impulse for a corporation is to make money. The moral imperative for a human being, I would hope, is to be a good human being and to develop good relationships. So the moral and philosophical creed of ethical culture really affirms loyalty to ideals and human dignity, to equality of rights, democracy, intellectual liberty, and social justice. And so I resent, frankly, sharing that position as an individual, as a human being, with a corporation, which does not have that moral imperative. And even more than that, as a woman, I resent it. And recently I went to the women's rally, Women United Against the War on Women, here in New York City last Saturday. And the fact that this particular Supreme Court will never, and Scalia, Justice Scalia has made that very clear, will never apply the 14th Amendment to equality and equal protection under the law for women, and yet it does apply to corporations, is something I find profoundly unethical. And I think I'll leave it there and go hear from the gentleman.
Thank you very much. Imam Feisal Abdul Rauf.
I need to borrow my microphone back.
You certainly have it.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for inviting me to this very interesting discussion. I have a confession to make. When I was first invited, I said, well, gee, what does religion have got to do with campaign finance reform, and why am I asked to come and speak as a Muslim? But I came to the realization through my discussions with those who were planning it that there is something that many people would like to learn about our tradition. Many people do not realize that there were very few prophets who were successful in their time in terms of being rulers. The ones that come to mind most of all are King David and King Solomon, who had issues, who were kings, who were rulers, who had relationships of state with other states and other nations. And the Prophet Muhammad was one of those few prophets who also succeeded in his lifetime, but his community and his immediate legacy was to leave a community and a continuing tradition. And thus in Islam we have an unbroken theological, jurisprudential tradition of law on the concept of right and good governance. It emanates from the Quran, which for us is our scripture, and which we believe to be the word of God, and also from the teachings of the Prophet and his legal precedents, his decisions and actions, and his normative practice. From these, we learn that the principles of our law is all about justice, about helping the underprivileged in society, helping the poor. In fact, there are verses, in fact, in the Quran that talk about not only the duty of the wealthy to the poor, but that those in whose wealth the poor and the underprivileged have a right, have even a claim upon their wealth. The notion that we share in the Abrahamic faith traditions is the equality of man that you talked about, of all human beings, that we're all equal. Because in the pre-Abrahamic traditions, there was a class system or a caste system. The pharaoh was considered semi-divine, as was Caesar, as was the emperor of Japan was considered like the son of God or something like that. And yet people were born, lived, worked, married, and died in one class. They couldn't move from one class or one caste system to another. So the notion of the equality of all human beings is, I think, one of the fundamental things in common of the Abrahamic faith tradition, which has actually expanded and into the other faith traditions as well in the modern day. In fact, I regard humanism or secular humanism to be the second commandment of the two major commandments of Deuteronomy, and when Jesus was asked what's the greatest commandment, he said to love the Lord thy God with all of your heart, all of your mind, all of your soul, and all of your strength. I'm conflating two different quotations of the New Testament here. And the second commandment, which he said is equal to the first, is to love thy neighbor as thyself. And this concept, and then he goes on to say, upon these two commandments hang all of the law and all of the prophets. And Islamic law emanates from these. In fact, all of law in Islam is divided into laws pertaining to what you might call first commandment laws on how to worship God, etc. And then second commandment laws is, which is humanistic laws, or laws which pertain to personal status law, business law, contract law, laws of governance, and criminal law. But laws of governance is one of the aspects of Islamic jurisprudence which has been quite developed. The other thing I'd like to share is that in the development of our law and jurisprudence, the jurists said that all of the objectives of the laws, all the commandments, the 10 commandments, etc., all of them are intended to protect and further 6 overarching objectives. And these are life. This is why thou shalt not kill is about life. Human dignity, thou shalt not slander, is about dignity, human dignity, and human worth that you spoke about. Religion, again, you have commandments about not taking the name of the God in vain. Intellect, which is why for Muslims the consumption of alcohol and mind-altering drugs that weaken your ability to think clearly and to exercise good judgment is prohibited. The advancement of protection of property, the right to property, and the right to a family. And in fact, to me, and I've written about this elsewhere, the American Declaration of Independence expresses these values so perfectly. In the language of our founding fathers, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and property. And property was then edited into pursuit of happiness. So you see from this that life and liberty I map to dignity, our concept of dignity and human worth. And then what do we do to pursue our happiness? We seek property, we seek to get married and take care of our loved ones and have a family. We seek to practice the faith that whatever we believe, and we seek to intellectual pursuits, whether it's doing the crossword puzzle or studying philosophy. So here, and the concept, all of these are not firewalled from each other. The concept of human dignity is very important. And then our declaration goes on. This is the American Declaration, by the way, that governments are instituted amongst men to grant these rights, to make sure that these rights are delivered to the people. And when government does not fulfill these rights, then it's the right of the people to change their government. This is our society, our social contract. In the words of another famous president, our government is a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, not for some of the people. And one of the things that occurred to me as a result of this recent Citizens United Supreme Court case is that it seemed to enable our government to be a government perhaps moving towards a government of the rich, by the rich, for the rich. And when you have an ability to put together a corporation that has become now a person, I was thinking of the novel 1984, where now we're going to have maybe human beings are going to be pushed out, and it's going to be a government of corporations, for corporations, by corporations, and that the corporations maybe are the ones who are going to be the new citizens of this particular state. So sometimes concepts come to us very subversively. I was thinking of this word. In a very subversive manner. But there's something that I find morally unacceptable about something that attacks our human worth, our value, our human worth, our human dignity, and pits people against each other versus these artificial concepts that the corporation is an artificial person, and now that although it's an artificial person, it has real impact and adverse impact upon the well-being of society. If we are all created, the whole idea of this notion that we're created in the image of God means, and that we are to love God and to love our neighbor, means that these two commandments are actually one. That we are to love God and to love the image of God in each one of those 6 or 7 billion inhabitants on earth today. And that is our duty. The other duty that we share in our traditions, all of our traditions, that we're to be good stewards of the earth. And part of stewardship, part of leadership, part of the role of the prophets, part of the role of even those who were in positions of leadership, is to serve their community. We are taught, in fact, the notion of religious leader is not something which comes from our religious vocabulary. In our traditional language, you will not find this word. You cannot translate the word religious leader into Arabic. The prophet is called the servant of God. Jesus did not call himself a leader. He came to serve the people, to wash the feet of his disciples, to help, to cure the sick, to help people, not to be a lord over people. So the notion of walking in the tradition of our prophets, which for us as Muslims is an important part of our teaching, to become like the prophet is to become a servant of God and to be a servant of humanity. And our elected officials have pledged an oath to serve their constituents. And their constituents are all of their constituents, and not those who are able to skew the results by their funding. It's unfortunate that the nature of our government today has become such that those who wish to run for political office need enormous amounts of money. And I think we have created the system whereby the need for vast amounts of money has forced them to rely on this. And this dynamic has resulted in skewing the nature of our government. And this is not good for us, not good in the long run, not good for America's position in the global world, because I travel a lot around the world, and I've seen how some of the results of those who have funded some of our candidates for highest political office make statements which make us the laughingstock of people in other parts of the world. And for a country that is a global superpower, a country that is deemed to be a leader and an exemplar in the world scene, it does not bode good for who and what we are. It is my prayer and my hope that we in this country can fulfill the aspirations of our founding fathers, which was to establish a nation that that recognizes these inalienable rights that come out of a tradition of faith, of all faiths, and that emphasizes the common ground, which is much wider and that bonds us in common than the few minor differences that differentiate us, but should never divide us. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Rabbi David Saperstein.
I'm truly honored to be with my distinguished colleagues here and honored to be in this historic institution that represents a community and tradition so committed to social justice. It is a particular pleasure for me to have the opportunity to be here under the auspices of Common Cause, which I think anyone who works in the field would acknowledge is first among equals of those who have been involved in the efforts at campaign finance reform, not only in New York State and New York City, but all across America. My ties with Common Cause are long. At my graduation at Cornell University, John Gardner announced the launching of Common Cause. I had the honor of serving for a number of years on the national board of Common Cause under the tenure of Fred Wertheimer and Archibald Cox, the legendary legal scholar and chair of Common Cause at that time. And a number of the heads of the organization have been close personal friends, and I'm a great admirer of the work that the New York State chapter and the New York City efforts have undertaken. So I'm really pleased to be here. Judaism, not surprisingly, shares many of these values that were talked about. I want to start at that point and talk about how the tradition applies it more directly to the issue of campaign finance reform, because campaign finance reform is not just about interests. It is about core moral principles, core ethical ideas of a society. And the Jewish tradition teaches that ethical standards must be present in all aspects of political life. Now, these views are based on warnings in our ancient texts about the dangers of mixing money and politics. Deuteronomy 16 says, "You shall not judge unfairly. You shall know no partiality. You shall not take gifts, for gifts blind the eyes of the discerning and upset the plea of the just." So in the Jewish tradition, judges who had in many capacities the clear judicial responsibility we have, but insofar as they served on the Sanhedrin, legislative responsibilities as well, they were forbidden for taking money from any parties. That idea was developed in the Talmud, written at the time that Jesus was alive. What is the reason for the prohibition against taking a gift? Because as soon as a person receives a gift from another, that person becomes so well disposed toward the person who gave the gift that that person who gave the gift becomes like yourself, and no person is willing to see themselves in the wrong. Public accountability is represented in Rabbi Yitzchak of the Talmud, who wrote, "A ruler is not to be appointed until the community is first consulted," an idea that in modern democratic terms reminds us it is necessary for elected officials to be accountable to all the citizens, not just to the wealthy and the moneyed interests. Well, the effects of our present campaign finance reform violates every one of the core values that you heard espoused here in the models of my tradition and the other traditions represented here. They are pernicious, these effects, especially in the wake of Citizens United. Our current practices, permitting unlimited corrosive flows of money into our political system, reduces voter access to elected officials, erodes moral standards in our government agencies and institutions, breeds distrust and alienation. No wonder public skepticism is so rampant in American society today, while trust in the Congress is so low, at staggering all-time levels. And take that in tandem with ideologically driven efforts, often abetted by corporations, to try and suppress the turnout in particularly more marginalized segments of the American populace. And it raises a profound moral challenge to the soul of America. How can we ever expect a fair result in our political system if the very rules of the game are unfair? And how can we expect morally sound public policy when the system itself ensures disproportionate influence of the richest and most powerful? How can we, whose religious calling includes the imperative to speak for the widow and the orphan and the poor and the children, accept an electoral process which structurally and systematically favors the rich? How can we acquiesce in a system which forces those who seek public office or who wish to continue in public service to spend so much of their precious time and energy not raising the nation's moral conscience, but raising campaign funds? I live in Washington, living and breathing what happens on Capitol Hill. I cannot exaggerate how overwhelming is the requirement of elected officials on Capitol Hill to spend large segments almost every day to raise money. It really is something extraordinary. And 2010 marked the most expensive midterm election in American history. Congressional candidates collectively spending over $1.5 billion to secure office. And we've seen the 2012 election shape up similarly in terms of record high spending levels. This is really something extraordinary. The question is, what can we in the religious community do particularly about this? Well, first, we have a long history of advocating on all kinds of causes that link us together. And campaign finance reform needs to be one of those. I'm proud of the role that many of our faith groups represented here have played. On my own community, the Reformed Jewish community, it's been one of the leaders of some of the coalitions that have fought some of these battles over the last 30 years. Indeed, we are very proud of our Reformed Jewish Voice here in New York. That is a state Reformed Jewish advocacy entity representing our movement, which has become a model for other state initiatives across the country. They deal with a number of issues, but right now we're focused on the election. And this very Monday, over 50 representatives of our synagogues are going to be up in Albany lobbying on campaign finance reform, because we believe it goes to the moral, ethical core that we are called to stand up and protect in our public life. Well, we have the Disclose Bill in the United States Congress that would require transparency. That is one way of getting a step forward that clearly would be constitutional in this area. There are efforts to consider constitutional amendments to overturn Citizens United. Another way of doing that. There's calls for the Security and Exchange Commission to enhance regulations requiring transparency. We've seen interesting shareholder campaigns now beginning to be mobilized in which grassroots people are standing up and saying, I want to use my proxy, I want to use my shareholder vote to insist that any political contributions that this corporation I've invested in is going to make, that they reveal those to the public and to their shareholders as well. On the other side, we have the Jones Bill here that Walter Jones, who I like in many other regards, but has introduced year after year, getting as 176 sponsors and people voted for it in the House of Representatives, trying to eliminate the ban on religious groups from endorsing political candidates from the pulpit, and in some of the variants he's done, actually making campaign finance reforms. If you think Citizens United was bad, wait till people can actually funnel their campaign contributions through a church, get a tax deduction for it, and what's going to happen to the churches and religious communities of America? We don't have enough trouble. We have to have our churches divided along who the electoral endorsements and political campaign money is going to go to. So there is a lot that can be done. Here in New York State, there are a number of efforts at Clean Money that Common Cause and other groups, allied groups, have been involved with. The religious community needs to step up as allies in this work. The governor promised in his State of the Union address he would develop a public financing system. It's about time it has happened here in New York. It works in New York City. It works in other states across the country. New York State needs to set a model of a large state that is willing to undertake that. We see New York City State Comptroller Tom DiNapoli and New York City Public Advocate Bill de Blasio, talking about trying to work with shareholder resolutions via the pension funds to corporations to insist on transparency. There's a lot of work going on right now, and we need to be in the middle of that and stand up for this. In the end, this is about our core values. Are we going to acquiesce in an unjust system, or are we going to say that we will not accept a system which generates disproportionate influence to those with money and deep pockets and bulging wallets, thereby undermining the principle of equal opportunity for all who seek the privilege of public office? That we will not accept the current system which reduces voter access to elected leaders and reserving the meeting rooms of Congress and the rooms in the White House for those who primarily have come up with the greatest monetary rewards. And we will not accept the current system which holds public policy hostage to special interests. Rather, our role is to insist that we stand up for the creation of a fairer, more just, more ethical campaign finance system, one which will reinforce and enhance the principles of American democracy, a system that can salvage our collective faith in public service. That ought to be our pledge, a vigorous support for all of these efforts until we really have eviscerated the impact of this unfair system and lifted up American democracy to be the shining light that it must be to the world. Thank you.
With thanks to all of my fellow panelists, I want to add just a little bit, not so much to their eloquence, but to something from the background of my own Christian tradition. It's interesting to me that all four of the speakers so far have stressed the doctrines of human dignity. To believe in God is to believe in a dignity that exceeds that of all that is. To think that human beings share in the dignity of God, which is what we mean when we say we are all made in the image of God, is to make an awesome claim for the human person. My colleague here, Alison Boden, may not remember, but she narrated to us something she did as a student at Union Seminary, which was to be an intern and chaplain at the Harlem Hospital, where her job was, among other things, to usher the dead bodies of babies dead from AIDS into a dignified burial. You remember that? Imagine, according to tiny infants who have not yet proven their worth empirically to the rest of the society, have as an obligation of that society the right to a dignified burial. Well, the right of every human being to be treated with dignity because of their kinship to God the Creator is a common theme across this panel. And it has a power that certainly was behind the Declaration of Independence, but is also behind our political understandings of citizenship. Among other things, when it comes to money, we have a deep ethical obligation not to put certain aspects of human being up for sale. When we put human energy and the human body itself up for sale, we call it slavery. When we put our sexual energies up for sale, we call it prostitution. When we put our political opinions up to sale, we rightly call it corruption. There is a corruption in politics among all those people who are running for office, who think that with enough money they can persuade people to vote their way and for their interest. I grant that there is some righteousness in politics, and there are righteous users of money. But when we use money to misshape what citizens will understand about what we stand for as a candidate, we rightly call that propaganda. And in order to increase the quality of our political dialogue and discussion, we need to demand truth in in politics that is not for sale. The other thing that for me comes out of my own understanding of my own Protestant religious tradition is how much all of us in this American democracy owe to the struggles for the human vote in the history of the West, and especially of England and the United States. The right to go to that voting booth and in secret to cast a vote on behalf of our own political opinions and preferences is a sacred right in the sense that it expresses the sacred value of the human being as such. And the right to cast that vote is something that has been dearly won, partly by religious people, such as those who argued for the right of every human being to a vote in the English Revolution of the 1640s, and again in the American Revolution of the 1770s. Somebody has called, some historian has called the American Revolution a Presbyterian revolution. Well, maybe we Presbyterians are taking too much credit on that one. But in what sense was the American Revolution that? Well, it was that in the sense that those leaders of little congregations up and down the Appalachian Trail and down to Georgia, from New York to Georgia, as pastors of their little congregations, carried on political dialogue in the midst of those congregations. Some of us learned our understanding of politics in those congregations where we had to choose leaders and had to make judgments as to who ought to be the leaders. The analogy from church politics to secular politics is not always pretty. And not everything about politics, either secular or in congregations and denominations, is necessarily a model for each other. But the fact is that when human beings in religious congregations enter into discussion of what it means to be religiously loyal and also loyal as citizens, they are engaging in a form of discussion which is deeply democratic. Somebody has said the democratic system is government by discussion. And a great deal of the quality and the integrity of the discussion, though, depends on the truth that people will speak to each other. When with lots of money, political leaders aiming for office try to shape the truth and misshape the truth with lots of money on television and other means of communication, what we do is corrupt the quality of democratic discussion. When those members of the Democratic Party call me for a contribution to somebody's campaign, one of my problems in this society is that I distrust the way in which television, being so very expensive, will use my money to say things that maybe are neither true nor really directed toward the common good. Organization that helps sponsor this program, Common Cause, has made a great thing of our obligation as citizens and as politicians to serve the common good. There is a deep corruption in a politics which serves only the good of the politician or of some moneyed group behind the politician. I think we're all in agreement to that. With apologies to this body for maybe our monopolizing too much of the time of this hour and a half that we've dedicated, we now should turn this discussion toward that form of politics that I've recommended, namely discussion. So what are your questions or comments that you would like to share with all of us? I think we have some cards that will answer that question.
We'll ask people to keep passing cards. We've gotten some lengthy questions. I'm going to try and excerpt some of the essence of what people are asking. The first question is really asking, is there an analogy between Martin Luther's activities in the 1500s in pushing back the constraints of the Catholic Church, and what we're seeing right now with Occupy Wall Street and the Arab Spring and the use of social media to really open up the dialogue. Do you see any commonality there?
Well, I think I'll try to answer a little bit of that one, because Martin Luther's protest against the Vatican had to do with the Vatican's attempt to help to get people to buy the favor of God in instruments called indulgences. Luther's claim was that we are saved by the grace of God and not by anything we can do to win God's favor, ecclesiastically or otherwise. That was itself an affirmation of human dignity before God. And I think it had its contribution to the development eventually of a democracy in which religion refused to support the sale of God's grace and of our love for each other. The rest of my panel may have something to say about that, though.
Religious finance reform is what Luther is asking for.
Okay.
Let me just say one word about it. Here, I am not going to answer in terms of Luther, but just an observation about the three huge protests or phenomena of the last year. The Arab Spring that really sought to change government and to release the yoke of oppressive governments. Here, extraordinary occurrence, we don't know what the end of that is going to be, but that was its goal. The second extraordinary protest movement actually happened in Israel, when kind of middle America of Israel, people who had not been involved very much, took to the streets in demonstrations that dwarfed the other demonstrations that we're talking about here. At the height of the demonstrations, they had 1/6 of the population, the equivalent of 45 million Americans, on the streets in peaceful demonstrations, aimed not at changing the form of government, but changing the policies about it. The Occupy thing, much smaller group, but it didn't try to overthrow the government, and it didn't try to come up with its policy prescriptions. It tried to give a moral outrage, and I actually think if you stop and reflect on it, it is the closest to the prophets. The prophets didn't say, hey, I have a plan, a stimulus plan, how to get people back to work, and here's my proposal, our proposal to the Jeremiah proposal to balance the budget. It said the poor are not being cared for. The hungry are starving. This is an immoral system. Fix it. And that's in essence what the Occupy phenomenon was here too. And in that sense, I let you make the connection with Martin Luther, but I make it with the prophets in terms of that. And I find it to be a very powerful resonance to the prophetic tradition that all of us share.
I'd like to speak briefly to Occupy Wall Street, because I think the call went out also to people of faith. And one of the many working groups that came out of Occupy Wall Street was Occupy Faith, of which I'm a member. And the impetus there was to say exactly what David says, and that is that it's a moral issue, that economics is a moral issue. A budget is an ethical statement. It's a moral statement about what society values. And we need to understand that, and we need to participate in that process. So I'm delighted that, one of the things that happened after the expulsion from Zuccotti Park was that so many of these working groups then took on lives of their own and then expanded. So what's terrific, I think, about Occupy Faith is that not only is it an interfaith group of people who want to really be effective about bringing that message, taking that message out, but it also has spread across the country. And I think it makes, we were talking earlier in the green room about what it means to have separation of church and state, and I interpret it as being, I can't get up at the lectern and say vote for this person or don't vote for that person. I can, however, and indeed I must, speak to my own ethical values. And so I think that's why we as a congregation participated in Occupy Wall Street. I continue to participate in Occupy Faith. And one thing I forgot to mention before is another way in which we here at the Ethical Society make statements is that we gave the Ethical Humanist Award in 1998 to Senators John McCain and Russell Feingold for their commitment to campaign finance reform. Of course, we know that Some aspects of that bill have been torn apart by the Supreme Court, and of course the Citizens United is just, we focused a lot of energy on that, but the whole system was pretty terrible before that, so that's...
Okay, next one. We've got some really interesting questions, so I'm trying to assimilate and get to the core of them. This question is pretty short. Is there a way to prevent campaigns from running up the type of debt that both Hillary Clinton and Newt Gingrich seem to face? Are there teachings in the Jewish and the Islamic tradition which might be relevant to the question of debt?
It's the question of debt.
Well, that is something which has to be paid off, and in fact, that is something which one should not die and be indebted. It's considered, in fact, in our traditional jurisprudence, you don't even go on pilgrimage until you pay all your debts. It's something which is deemed to be of such major importance that you should discharge any such obligation. Unfortunately, in the modern era, we are a very debt-driven society. We all have debts on our mortgages, on our homes, and loans on our cars, and that's the way the modern economy lives and survives. But the importance, what it points to at a deeper level, is the role of money and the importance of money and the obligations that we have to the financial obligations that we have all to each other, and how we should feel a sense of responsibility in terms of discharging those obligations. I think most of us, regardless of our faith traditions, our grandparents and maybe even our parents were taught not to have debt. You saved your money and then you bought a house. You saved your money and then bought a car. We have completely changed the system, and who is to say? I'm not an economist, but I think part of the problem that we have had and the financial meltdown we have had may have been as a result of this playing around with the fires of debt and financial obligations between individuals, institutions, and nations in such a way that has created major problems for many, many innocent human beings.
The one I talked about before, judges are not able to take gifts at all about it. And again, judges had both a legislative and a judicial role here. So that would be one principle. The second is drawn from the rules about charity. You should give generously to charity, but never so much as to impoverish yourself, to make yourself economically vulnerable. If one extrapolates from that, from the individual act to the entity partnerships, they didn't know corporations, but partnerships, it would apply to that as well. And third, the Rambam, the Maimonides, the greatest of the medieval Jewish scholars, talked over and over again about moderation. Excessiveness of any kind was frowned upon. We had no ascetic tradition like other faiths had, but we had clear prohibitions against exorbitant spending for its own sake. And I think those three things taken together say a system that is a rational system, able to moderate itself in ways that achieves ethical goals for the society without excessive kind of spending would be the kind of system that would be the most ethical here as well.
I think that all references to the prophets so far here would help sustain the notion that we in politics must not only talk about the cost it takes to get elected, but we should be talking about debt and budgets in the way that money gets spent by government itself. We should be much more careful in asking our political representatives whose ethics and what ethics are they going to put into effect in their decisions about the budget of government. A reporter once asked Ted Kennedy, why is it, Senator Kennedy, that you are so frequently making reference to questions about poor people? And Kennedy looked kind of quizzical, and his answer was, haven't you ever read the New Testament? Well, there are politicians who claim to be Christians who need to show that they are Christians by the way they apply the New Testament to questions of budget and other such matters of justice in government.
So this is, I think, a very interesting and very provocative question that I think goes to the heart of some of the different approaches in our society. And I'm going to read this exactly as it was given to me. If God rewards us with different amounts of riches, why is it surprising that we would also be rewarded with different amounts of influence?
Can you repeat the question?
Yes. If God rewards us with different amounts of riches, why is it surprising that we would also be rewarded with different amounts of influence? And I think this is a very important question.
I simply would like to be sure we recall the democratic doctrine that every person deserves to have some influence, and we express that in the right to vote, which has nothing to do with how wealthy you are. What other panelists would say to that question?
Yeah, just for myself, in the particular, probably the particular part of Protestant Christianity that I come from, have a really difficult time wrapping my mind and spirit around the idea of what that we enjoy in our lives is purely a blessing from God, and what has really been made possible structurally. Is God not blessing the many, many people in this country who are poor? And if so, why not? What is wrong with them that they have not met God's favor? What is it about the structures, the economic and political and social structures in our country that have contributed to the fact that they aren't rich? And if we're going to say that God gives the blessing of riches, do we not also have to say that God gives the curse of poverty? That's not where my own theological thinking goes.
I think it's worthwhile recalling that the prophets of Israel, as well as many witnesses in our religious traditions, were often not rich people. They won their influence by the power of their rhetoric and their devotion to spiritual truth.
You know, in the Jewish tradition, it wrestles exactly with this, Susan. Here, and it recognizes there's a paradox here. There was no mandate of egalitarianism when it came to money. The tradition recognizes some people will be richer than other people, and that hard work and creativity and good fortune blesses people in ways that it doesn't other people, and it recognizes those differences between people. But when it talked about the structures of society, it went out of its way to say there has to be equality. What are these rules? You don't favor the rich and the poor. Although in Baba Metzia, in the Talmud, there's an argument about a person who makes a claim against the wealthiest, most powerful person in the community, saying, "I'm your long-lost brother. Give me half your money." And the guy says, "That's absurd. You're not my long-lost brother." And they go to court over this, and the court says, "Do you have any evidence that you're his long-lost brother?" And the court, and the guy says, "Well, I do, but my witnesses are scared to testify because my brother is so powerful." And the court turns to the powerful brother and says, "Do you have any witnesses he's not your brother?" The guy says, "What kind of absurdity is that? How would I prove he's not my brother?" And the court concludes sometimes the law, to be fair, can't be enacted the same for the rich and the poor. That's not a normative view in the tradition, but a recognized in real life. You have to make things work out so that people have an equal chance. Judaism 2,000 years ago created the first system of universal education, which every Jewish child, rich and poor, was entitled to go to a public school run by the community. Let me correct that. Every Jewish boy, rich and poor, was entitled to go to although every Jewish girl was taught to read and write it at home. Here, in when Joshua ben Gamliel creates that school system, the tradition is very clear. Why? Be sure that the children of the poor are educated, for out of them come the greatest of our rabbis. The rabbinic system, as opposed to the priesthood, was a meritocracy. Here. The same is true in terms of leaders of your community, most of our communities. You get to do it not by dint of descendancy here, but by the intelligence and talents of the people. So there were social structures guaranteeing equal access. There were legal structures guaranteeing equal access. And it didn't do it as a way to stifle the economic energy of people. It lived with that paradox that there would be people of equal wealth. They could use that wealth to benefit themselves in ways here, but when it came to the public structures, everyone had to be treated equally, and our campaign finance system fails to do that.
I just want to add something that the concept of poverty and wealth in our tradition, and I think it's shared with other traditions, is not always a reward. It is sometimes a test. It is sometimes a challenge. Jesus was quoted saying, "Blessed be the poor, for they shall be called." I forgot the conclusion of that. But there is a blessing in poverty. But there's also, as you said, a curse in poverty. There's a saying of our prophet where he said, "I take pride in being poor. Poverty is my cloak and my pride." And yet there is another saying of the prophet where he says, "If poverty were a person, I would have killed him." Because poverty, dire poverty can make people reject God and disbelieve in God. So we have this thing, and the prophet has, well, the Quran and the prophet's teachings have numerous statements how wealth can be a trial, and it is a trial and a test for many people. And I think there is, in both our Christian Muslim tradition statements, the fact that it is more difficult for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven than a camel to go through the eye of a needle. So wealth is not always a good thing. Wealth, and yet the prophet has also said that the best person is a person who is deeply pious and wealthy, who uses his wealth for the well-being of the community, who gives his wealth in charity, who does not make his wealth an impediment for him to attain what you call, let's say in Christian language, the kingdom of heaven. I think these are the hypothesis of the question that wealth is always a reward is not something that is universally, I think, accepted in our theology and in our jurisprudence. And certainly our role as being stewards and responsible people is that we should utilize and deploy our wealth. We are, in fact, in all our traditions, we are trustees. Whatever we are given of material wealth, of intellectual wealth, of influence, are things given to us in trust. We will use them. It's like a card game. We are given this deck of cards. We play the game well, we'll win the end result. But many of us fall short in that regard. And I think that is the fundamental moral and spiritual and religious imperative.
As a good humanist, I don't particularly like the framing of the question because I don't believe that God has given these blessings. I think it has been stated before, wealth and poverty are human inventions and human structures, and certainly when we trace back our humanity before all of these institutions and all these structures, we lived in social groupings that conferred on different people different roles depending upon their innate gifts and their talents, and certainly saw to the equality of everyone because that was the only way you were going to survive. And I think that so much of the inequality comes out of civilization and comes out of the creation of these institutions. And so, and as far as being a reward or a curse, there's been a recent study about all these people who have won the lottery, and their happiness quotient very low. And we can also go back to the Beatles' famous song, "Money Can't Buy You Love." And I think that another thing that we all have in common in our faith traditions is that ethical relationships are based on love. And love is something that we humans nurture and share with one another. And that doesn't require money, although it does require that we are able to put food on the table, a roof over our heads, and guarantee access to good education for everyone. And I think that's where democracy must do a better job than it does. And that's an institution that we can all buy into if it does that job for everybody.
Time for one or two more questions.
Okay, I was actually, we have a bunch of wonderful questions, but I was actually thinking that this would be the final one because I think it really has been expressed a couple of different ways with different questions. And it's a sort of a two-part question. What more can be done to raise the level of public dialogue on the moral and unethical facets of our current system? That's the first part of this question. And the second is there an appropriate role here for religious leaders? And then the question is to stimulate more public outrage. So I guess the question really is there an appropriate role here for religious leaders in helping to raise the level of our public dialogue? How do you see the religious community as part of that process?
I actually think that, thanks to this conversation, religious communities may have a unique role to play, who might be uniquely located in all of this in a way that a lot of people on the surface might not think about. And what I'm thinking is, just because something is legal doesn't mean you should do it. Just because you can do something, and we could extrapolate for the rest of the evening, many of the things that we can do as individuals, as members of the society, there are many things you can do, but it doesn't mean you should. I think that religious communities are just very well placed to take the issue of how we are spending money in campaigns and say, you know what, it's the law of the land actually right now since January 2010. It is absolutely legal to try to buy an election, but that doesn't mean you should do it. You can try, but don't do it. And I think that we have a moral place, a moral location in our society that, again, just makes us uniquely placed to say that. And just saying that will raise awareness again and again and again of the situation we really do have on the ground.
One of the subjects was raised earlier was the issue of the separation of church and state, which is a constant, difficult challenge and problem for us. But one of the things that I believe that we, the religious community, should be is the conscience of our community. And I haven't figured out the solution to this yet, but I think it's important for us to figure out, I would like to see in this country an institutionalized conscience for our governance. Just like you have the Supreme Court is the ultimate arbiter of, let's say, the law and interprets the law of the land. It would be nice to have a division of government that's a division of conscience or something like that. I'm kind of like thinking out of the box a little bit. My point is that our role as religious communities is to be the conscience of our communities, but it is not enough to express our conscientious positions only as objections and outrage. I think there's a role for us as to somehow adjust to have the role of this conscience be constructive as well, because it's not enough. I mean, I as a manager, you know, of people who says, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong. Okay, I remember once telling an employee, you can't do this, can't do that. And he said, you know, Feisal, okay, I'm glad you tell me what not to do, but it's not enough to tell me what not to do. If you can help me by guiding me as to what I should do, that would help me move in that direction better. And many of us, even when we are growing or when we're trying to figure out solutions on what to do, we know this is wrong, but how to figure out the right way to do it is something I think that people generally want to do. I think people as a rule, even people in government, want to do the right thing. People have a natural proclivity to doing the morally correct thing, but they need guidance, and I think this is something that we should figure out a role for ourselves.
One final comment on that matter. It's not only that we as religious leaders should be trying hard to get our voices heard in this, that, and other public dialogue, But as leaders of organizations, we have a responsibility for giving voice to people in and through our organizations, people who may not otherwise have a voice. That's one of the great powers that many rabbis, imams, priests, and ministers have. Namely, they are leaders of an organization which can be, in the best sense of the word, a political forum. It's not a matter of joining church, state, synagogue, or the like. It's a matter of thinking that the divine voice has some megaphone through some human voices. And I think one thing we've said on this panel is that there are a lot of silenced voices in this country, and that especially the voices of the poor. Who is better equipped to give some voice to the voiceless than congregations of people who believe that that voice of the poor is important to give voice to? One more point, and that is a positive one. One thing we have said consistently in this panel is that money does not necessarily have the power to buy your or anybody else's vote. So long as we have something like a real democracy in this country, that is going to be the condition. When you go to a political rally or you stand in that voting booth next November, no matter how much money has been poured into the campaign, you have the freedom to vote what you think is best for the country and the common good. That freedom is something we should find very precious and something we can celebrate and be thankful for. I'm also thankful to those who put this panel together and giving us the privilege to be a part of it.
Thank you so much. I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge the tremendous help that I received from our national president, Bob Edgar, who sends his greetings to everybody on the panel. Bob is the former president of the National Council of Churches, a Methodist minister, and was absolutely instrumental in helping us get the outstanding leaders that we have and helping me in shaping the program. I want to thank our distinguished panel and our audience. You know, we're told it's not polite to talk about two things in gatherings. It's not polite to talk about religion. It's not polite to talk about politics. Tonight we've successfully talked about both, and I commend our panel for that. Thank you.
Thank you, folks.